Oh, didn't see you there. It's no secret that throughout the history of Canada, Indigenous peoples and communities have been mistreated by the government and European communities. Over the last couple of years and decades, the government has been apologizing for how they treated these people. Stephen Harper was the first Prime Minister to apologize in 2008. 2008, that's not that long ago. 22 years, if my math is correct. However, the government still acts in ways that makes it harder to progress in reconciliation. In this video, I will be talking about how is it truly possible for reconciliation to happen in Canada. I'm your host, Lincoln Matheson. Welcome to Disney Channel. Excuse me, sir. Could I ask you a question?
Sure.
What is reconciliation? I don't know, like...
I forgot.
Excuse me, sir. Can I read?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just gonna ask you one simple question. This is the worst environment to do it, but whatever. Do you think it's possible for Canada to reconcile with the past Indigenous history?
No, maybe, probably. I think so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask you guys a question?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you know about Indigenous history? Hold on. I have my question.
I know that it's very important to learn about, especially Canadian
Okay.
culture. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
I know that right now we are in the process of healing our relationship in Canada.
Okay.
I know that they were treated and still are treated highly unfairly with the residential schools and like past history and current history. So
Repeat answers are fine.
Okay. Orange shirt day.
Dude!
That's a thing.
That is a thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know that residential schools were really bad.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone said this, but I know that like Indigenous people have been like represented really badly like in the media in like past times.
Thank you guys so much for your awesome and well-developed answers.
Woo!
Hi. Can I ask you a question? Sure. Okay. How does one reconcile the story?
To recognize what was wrong and not only to just recognize it, but to also do something to fix it.
Thank you. Close enough.
Yeah.
Hi. When did the conflict start? That's a good question. When European settlers came to North America, they started making agreements with all the indigenous communities that lived there. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 established the rules for negotiation of the land. In the official document, it states, I'm gonna try my best British accent, and whereas it is just and reasonable and essential to our interest, and that's French, and the security of our colonies, that the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories, where am I, as not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved to them, or any of them as their hunting grounds. In shorter terms, it's saying that they couldn't just take the land without having proper agreements. In the creation of the country of Canada, our country, the government made it so that they had full jurisdiction over Indigenous peoples and their land. In 1876, the Indian Act of Canada was passed, which created heavy restrictions on Indigenous people. Flip the page. The Indian Act made it illegal for Indigenous communities to practice their culture or religious practices. The government also created residential schools for the First Nations children, and the goal of these institutes was to force Indigenous children into European and Christian culture. If you didn't assimilate into their way of living, you were most likely beaten. On the topic of land titles, specifically in British Columbia, the government did not acknowledge the need for proper negotiation. So, a lot of native territory in BC was taken without negotiation. I can't say that word. Throughout recent years, the government has attempted to let First Nations communities negotiate proper land titles. Although this sounds good at first, in reality, the actual process of negotiation takes a very long time, specifically in BC. There are only 7 First Nations in the final stage of the treaty process, where the treaty is actually being implemented. That's crazy. Oh, hey, didn't see you there. Now, we talked a lot about Indigenous conflicts, but now I want to talk about why those conflicts exist. Specifically, the question is, why do some organizations disrespect Indigenous communities? Well, the short answer is that many organizations, including the government, want more control over their land. They want to have all the control for themselves. They don't want these other, like the Indigenous communities, to have a say in what goes on. Why is this? Because it costs them more money to go around the land. Short answer. Everything's based on money, let's be honest, because it costs them more money to cooperate. In the infancy of Canada, the goal was to have as much land as possible. Unfortunately for the British, many Indigenous communities lived on that land that they wanted, and because of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, they couldn't just take the land. So what could they do? Well, one of the main sources of food and resources was the buffalo. We all know about the buffalo. Some historians suggest that buffalo were specifically targeted heavily so that native communities would be forced into submission to treaties. Flip page. And, okay, let's talk about the Indian Act for a second. When the Indian Act was passed, the government's goal was to make it harder for Indigenous nations to prosper. We already talked about this. They made it illegal for them to practice what they wanted because they wanted assimilation. They wanted Indigenous people to assimilate into European and white culture. As for recent examples of organizations disrespecting Indigenous communities, we have recent example, the Wet'suwet'en pipeline. Sorry, I don't speak the language. The Coastal GasLink is a project that wanted to create pipelines going through a lot of BC territory, specifically, in this case, Wet'suwet'en land. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Unfortunately, the company did not receive consent from the hereditary chiefs, and according to DRIPA and UNDRIP, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the government has to get official consent from the nation in order to continue. The people behind the pipeline did not want to detour from their path because that would cost them more money. To go, instead of a straight line, do a curved line, that's a lot more money. So, with the support of the government, the Canadian government, they went along with the project, regardless of if they got consent. Many people protested it, and some even got arrested. In the end, the pipeline was constructed, and the Wet'suwet'en people had no say in whether or not it should have happened. Now, in my opinion, that is a story of how greed took over the development of specific land that they did not have the right to, because Wet'suwet'en land, they held the title to that land. They held like the rules towards the land on what you should be able to do with it, but the government just ignored that. That's kind of stupid. Hello. Now, last stuff we talked about was pretty heavy about how, Indigenous communities and people have been treated over the years and how it's not been okay. But I want to switch gears a little bit to the main topic, reconciliation. Who is responsible for reconciliation? In Canada, we talk a lot about how we need to reconcile, but who should actually be focusing on the process of reconciliation? Well, for starters, the government, of course. The government is responsible for never practicing what happened in the past again. That's obvious. As citizens of Canada, we are responsible for acknowledging what happened in the past and not denying it. The government also needs to uphold their promises for treaties and for the rights of First Nations. Now, of course, in a perfect world, these things sound easy for us to do. Unfortunately, it seems as if the government only cares about their wallet and the profit more than their citizens' well-beings. Case in point, the 94 calls to action were created to help with truth and reconciliation. Out of the 94 calls to action proposed, only 15 actions have actually been taken, and 17 haven't even started. I don't know who's going, but oh well. This shows that the government sucks at efficiency. As for the people of Canada, there are still some people who deny what happened at the schools, and some people are just, flat out racist, and it sucks. Hello. Now we talked about who is responsible for reconciliation. Now let's talk about what are the steps towards reconciliation. Reconciliation means to gain peace between two or more conflicting parties. That's like the most basic definition I can think of for reconciliation. As previously stated, the government must uphold their agreements, and the people must acknowledge the history. If you really care about reconciliation, like if you're really passionate about it, you could try to contribute to your local First Nations community by participating in any events they are having. That's all I really have for that section. Now let's go on to how you can learn more about the history. Last question. Second to last question, but whatever. For a lot of people, they never got to go in depth about Indigenous history and what happened with, the Indian Act and residential schools. For some people, they never got to learn about that. For that reason, I can understand the ignorance. However, there's still resources available for learning about the history. You can go online and read articles, or go to the library and pick up books on Indigenous history. There are a lot of resources you can use. I'm going to list at least one resource. One good website is the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, where they talk about the early history of Canada throughout the website and other stuff like that, and Indigenous communities. And another website is nativeland.ca, native-land.ca. If you're passionate about your research and you have dispensable money, you can even take college courses dedicated to Indigenous studies, but I understand that actually costs money and takes a lot of time. But it doesn't cost money? The internet. That's a lie. Computers cost money and phones cost money. You know what I don't think costs money? Libraries. I actually don't know. I haven't used a library in a while. Just ask around. Someone will tell you about the history eventually. Oh, didn't see you there. Now, throughout this essay, we've been talking a lot about reconciliation for the past and for the Indigenous communities of Canada. The main question I want to answer is reconciliation possible? Now, this is why we have a script. Throughout this discussion, we've talked about what the government and people should be doing to promote reconciliation. In a perfect world, the government would look after their people over their wallets, and every Canadian citizen would make an effort to learn more about the past injustices. Unfortunately, our world will always have a government more obsessed with creating promises rather than implementing them, and some people will always be disrespectful and racist. Quite frankly, it's terrible. So for those reasons, True reconciliation is unfortunately not possible. Even though it's not possible, that doesn't mean we can't get close to reconciliation. Because if one person makes the effort to do better in this world, to learn more about the history, then that's better than no one. Thank you for listening.